Reverb and delay are essential in Psytrance production. Today I'll show you how to use them. So today we're in this production over here. This is a collaboration that I started with Subject Ultra that I featured before on my channel. And what I mainly want to do is I just want to go through some of the one-shots that sit in here and maybe some of the sequences and talk a little bit about how I would use delay and reverb on top of them. Now, of course, since this is an active production, a lot of the elements already have reverb and delay on them. But what I'll do is I'll give you a few examples of different reverb and delay settings that I like to use. So when it comes to the reverb and delay, it is very context dependent. It is very dependent on the element that you're putting it on. For example, when it comes to stuff like sequences, these generally need less reverb and delay because they're more upfront in the mix. And also they repeat more often. Whereas something like a one-shot, this stuff over here, you can imagine that the one-shot plays here, but it has all of this space for it to reverb and delay out. Now, of course, maybe in the future there's going to be another one-shot that sits maybe over here or even over here, but it gives you either 2 or 4 bars of space for your reverb and delay to actually decay out. Now, there's other reasons why you would have a reverb and delay that is longer or shorter. One example is a cut reverb or delay that is something like this. This is a sound that Subject Ultra sent to me, and you can see that the reverb and delay plays up until one specific point and then it just cuts out. Now, this is very deliberately done so that it adds a little bit of extra movement to the groove in the sense that here something stops and that is something that you actually notice in the track. You can kind of hear this resonant spike playing up until a certain point and then it stops, and that is where you notice, hey, we're going into new elements, we're having a new change to the groove or something like that. So this is a different musical idea than just having the delay and reverb ring out all the way up until the next point that a new sound plays. So in this case that would be delaying for 2 bars. Now, there's also sounds in my sequences that don't actually use any delay. When it comes to reverb, I tend to put a little bit of reverb at least on every element, but some elements specifically require no delay. So something like this over here. You can hear that this is just a plug that adds something to every 2 bars that it plays in, but we already have a lot of plugs that kind of have this trailing feeling over here. So as a contrast to that, I want to have a plug that is very, like, in your face, and therefore there's no delay, meaning that there's no trailing feeling to the sound, and you can really hear the difference that brings. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get into some actual settings that I like to use. So here's just a good example of a very basic delay setup, the way that I like to use it. As you can see, I like to use 1/8 dotted notes. And in particular, I like to use Echo Boy Jr. here. 1, because it has this white mode over here. And 2, because it has these 7 different flavors of delay, which basically just changes the frequency response of which frequencies get delayed how much. Meaning that you can get a very bright delay, for example. Or if you want a bit more of a muffled one, you can set it, for example, to memory. But there's also other textual changes. For example, this ambient over here turns into a little bit of a reverb. You can hear that it's a little bit more washed out in this case. But for this particular sound, I really like the brightness that we get from the transmitter over here. And then, of course, the other important settings are the feedback and the mix, which generally speaking, I like to set just by ear. As I said before, it is based on how much space that I have in terms of the one-shots that are already there. And this is, of course, one of those settings that you constantly go back into and change as the production progresses. You can imagine that if I decided to add new one-shots right after it, that I would need to change how the delay and reverb interact with those one-shots. Because at the end of the day, you can think of it like this. With your delay and reverb, what you're really trying to create is that kind of flowy movement in all of the sounds. To me, a well-constructed Psytrance track tends to push and pull on you through its delay tails and through its reverb. And of course, also the one-shots and the sound themselves help in that as well. This is like a fundamental concept of a Psytrance track, including with how you set up your sequences, how you set up the automations for those sequences. You'll often hear that the track tends to go up and down many times within a segment. And you can achieve the same thing with your delay and reverb by just having a delay and reverb that kind of pulls and pushes against you. So pushing against you is something that we've already seen. That is something that this element does. You can kind of hear it go up into the point where it becomes the loudest, and then it delays and fades out from there. So it starts to push against you fairly quickly and then it releases again over a longer period of time. But there's more interesting things that you can do. For example, we have this atmosphere over here, which is really long. As you can see, if I zoom in, it's almost 12 bars long, this whole atmospheric idea here. And what you'll see is that it starts off as a normal kind of clap, but then it transitions slowly into more like reverby atmosphere. So this sounds like this. You can even get this very resonant tonal spike that is really washed out due to the reverb. So in this case, what I would say here is that it kind of pushes against you, the clap happens, it kind of comes up into your face, then it starts to fade out, and then it slightly comes back again in the more atmospheric form, and then that fades out once more. So you have the first push, this is where the big impact happens of the sound, it fades out over here, and then from here on it starts rising again, and then it starts to fade out again. So the way that this is achieved is through a bunch of different automations. Let's dive into them now. As you can see, there's 3 automations that make this work. The main one that is interesting in this case is the reverb over here, because of the way that it works when you set it to the feedback mode over here. You can imagine that the reverb is added every time to the signal as it loops and loops and loops throughout that delay. Because for those that don't know, every time the sound plays and the delay has to be generated, what it will do is it will take that sound and it will delay it by a certain amount, and then it will re-put it into its original input again, so that it can make the next sound, and then it goes back into the input again, so that it delays and then gets the next sound, and that goes on and on and on for every hit. So you can imagine that if we have a certain amount of feedback and we start adding reverb on top of that, that reverb is going to basically exceed the limit of the feedback, and therefore it's going to become louder every time that it plays. At least that is the behavior that we're getting here with these particular settings. So the sound, every time that it plays, becomes more and more reverberated, and at some point it also becomes louder. So you can see that happening over here, and that is at this point where we cut it off, and then over here the black hole reverb takes over, and that is what makes it fade out over time. Of course, together with the delay of the actual sound itself, that is now also in the feedback chain but doesn't get any additional reverb from this point on. Now when it comes to reverb, you saw me use black hole over here. This is one of the reverbs that I really like. This has a very unique texture to it, and it sometimes just works really well on certain sounds, but sometimes it just does not work. This is like a very sound specific type of reverb. Generally speaking, when it comes to my main reverb, I don't like that. I like a reverb that works on a lot of different sounds. And for that, I like to use a different reverb, which is Turbo Reverb. You may have seen this in some earlier content of mine. I have used it in a couple of shorts as well. But this is a reverb that basically does everything. As you can see, you have a bunch of different categories over here. And then within those categories, you have your subcategories. So these all have different textures to them and different capabilities. And then for each of the ones that you see over here, you're also going to get a big list of different textures for that specific type of reverb. Now, all of these are all different algorithms, meaning that this is a type of algorithmic reverb that can do a variety of different sounds, because literally for every category, the algorithm is different. What happens with a lot of other reverbs is that the algorithm is always the same, and you basically have a choice of either very limited amount of algorithms or just one algorithm. For example, if you just go into the default reverb inside of Ableton over here, this is just one algorithm. There's no way to actually change the parameters of the algorithm that is being used under the hood. In the case of Turbo Reverb, there is a way to do that. As you can see over here, you can change the early reflections that it uses and also the algorithm that it uses for the late reflections. Now, personally, I have never bothered with this. I've never felt the need to actually write my own reverb algorithms, but there's probably a lot that you can do with it. What it means for this case, though, is that when it comes to a reverb plugin, this is a very versatile reverb plugin. And that's kind of what you want, because you want your huge spaces not only to be longer in terms of the reverb, but also sound differently in terms of their texture versus the very small spaces versus the kind of like medium spaces in here. I know it says large spaces, but it's basically better to say large, medium, and small. And then even outside of that, there's a whole bunch of different other types of reverbs, in the sense that there's very specific plates and springs reverbs over here. You have some creative things over here, which I never really use. You have these special things over here that I only use the shimmer from. And then you have this 2D positioning over here that I've also never used. But you can imagine that this way you get a very broad level of different textures for your reverbs. Now, where this becomes important is with that push and pull method that I talked about before. It is interesting if the delay and the reverb is constantly kind of changing in texture, not only with the sounds that they're playing on, but just in the general kind of texture that the reverb and delay have themselves. So again, with Echo Boy, in order to achieve that, I use this knob over here where I have the 7 different tones of delay that I can use. And then of course with M Turbo Reverb, I have all of the different options that I can choose from to dial in the exact texture that I want. Another reason why this large amount of different textures is useful is because not only does it help you with that flowing movement that I talked about before, but it also means that you can basically dial in the texture specifically for the element and basically have it be more unified with the element that you're applying the reverb or delay to. What I mean by that is I often hear people that have fairly dark delays and reverbs on very bright elements or the other way around, or people that are just using the wrong texture on that delay and reverb and therefore end up overcompensating by turning up the dry wet of that delay or reverb too high. One thing that you have to remember for delay and reverb is that it's always the main element first. That main element kind of has to stand out a little bit from the delay and reverb. Unless you are doing some very particular sound design ideas with those delays and reverbs, that is usually what I would go by, because that way your mix is still going to be clear. It is still going to be clear what the main element is. And overall, it just helps the listener of your track identify what is actually going on inside of your track. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and make sure that you're subscribed while you're there. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content. So I'll leave up 2 videos on the screen right now for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.